episode of Rethinking Christianity. Today we have Dan McClellan on. Thank you, Dan, for coming on. He is has a PhD from the University of Exeter on the cognitive science of religion and the conceptualization of deity and divine agency in the Hebrew Bible. I came across his work through TikTok or just some of the videos that he's been putting out on the Bible. Dan, if you want to let us know kind of what are you doing currently along with the stuff that you've been putting out on TikTok?
Well, thanks, Blake. I appreciate the kind words. I appreciate the opportunity here. Right now I'm busy taking care of 3 little girls. I've got a family I'm raising here in Utah that takes up the majority of my time, so I don't have a ton of additional time. But I also work full-time for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as a scripture translation supervisor. So my day job is overseeing the translation of uniquely Latter-day Saints scripture, as well as revisions of some Bible translations in other languages. And so that's my 9 to 5. And then when I have some free time to myself, which is not very frequent, I enjoy artwork. I enjoy playing golf. I enjoy movies and TV shows. And so right now, my wife and I are really looking forward to the new season of Stranger Things. But
Nice.
But don't have a ton of time for recreational stuff these days, just because the pandemic has squeezed us in a lot of different ways. But I was glad to find TikTok as a bit of an outlet for that, find a way to be a little creative, to engage with the broader community, and also hopefully to stem the tide of some of the misinformation that gets shared online. Yeah,
that's how I came across. And I mentioned this before we started. I came across your videos on TikTok of you just respond, because I would see these videos and some of them I wasn't as well informed on some of this topic specifically as you are, but I knew that some of the stuff that was being alluded to was not, it was either half truths or taking an idea and presenting it as full fact when like some of the stuff that you mentioned about data and things like that there wasn't data to prove these things. And so I came across your stuff and I was like, that's pretty good. And I think I actually have probably tagged you in like 20 plus of these videos because I'll just see them. I'll be like, I want to know what he thinks about that. And did you ever think, so I looked it up because I was curious. I was like, how many has he done? I think this morning is at 754 videos. Is that correct?
So after a couple hundred, 200 or 300, I actually started numbering them. So I'm probably around 1,000 so far.
Oh, wow. That's
but
crazy.
I looked back and it has not yet been a year since I first posted on TikTok. It was May 30th, I think, of last year when I posted my first video. So coming up on my anniversary here shortly.
Yeah. TikTok's it's an interesting platform because of the vast array of things that you can come across. And some of the stuff, I think part of it was I had liked certain videos that were, I guess, related to biblical studies or deconstruction. And that stuff kind of started to come across. Before we kind of get into that, I'd love to hear just some of your, how did you get interested in biblical studies? I think I read that you had a degree, you have an undergrad degree from, was it Brigham Young in ancient Near Eastern and classical? I'm not sure what the last portion of it was.
Yeah, I did my bachelor's degree in ancient Near Eastern studies, and I did a minor in classical Greek at Brigham Young University. And that was a program that had just started up a couple of years prior. I joined the LDS Church when I was 20 years old. And a year later, I left to serve as a missionary for 2 years in Uruguay. Had to learn Spanish, a type of Spanish they call Castellano. And someone gifted me a Spanish translation of the Bible that included the Apocrypha, as well as a Bible dictionary. And I loved reading some of these stories that I hadn't read before, like First and Second Maccabees and some of the other texts of the Apocrypha. And that and the Bible dictionary were just so fascinating to me. And I saw a page that was all Hebrew text, and it was a text from one of the Psalms. And I saw a table in another part of the book where it showed the Hebrew letters and their corresponding Latin characters. And I thought, I can't translate, but at least I can figure out what these letters are supposed to sound like with this table. So I printed out the Hebrew text, and I started annotating this thing, trying to decipher the Hebrew language on my own. And I was not incredibly successful, but I fell in love with the puzzle of ancient languages and of ancient history. And I fell in love with learning about these cultures and these people and how different they were from me. And at the time, I was in another culture that I was not familiar with, learning a new language. And I realized how much I wanted to learn how to see the world the way other people saw the world, instead of just the way I had been raised to see the world. And there are so many different perspectives out there. And I decided, wow, if I could study this as a career for the rest of my life, that would just about be the coolest thing in the world. And luckily, I was able to finagle my way into Brigham Young University for that undergrad. And then a couple of master's degrees later, I was able to get into a PhD program. And I was very fortunate to be able to get to do all that and to be in the position I am right now. It's not the most robust field in the world right now for finding jobs. So
Yeah.
It's been, but people talk about not having to work a day of your life if you enjoy what you do. And I really feel like that. Most of the time, I'm excited to get up and go to work. I don't like project management systems, and I hate all the administrative stuff I have to do. That is obviously work. But when I get to work with these folks all around the world and help them in these projects and get to know them better and their families and their cultures, it's just one of the coolest things in the world. So I've enjoyed it quite a bit, and I look forward to a lot more of it.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you mentioned that you joined the church when you were 20. So for me, like growing up, I grew up in a pretty conservative background of Protestant Christianity as a Southern Baptist. And that obviously had an influence on how I viewed the Bible and was taught to read the Bible and things like that. So when you joined at 20, did you have a previous like I guess lens in which you were viewing the Bible through, or were you able to kind of approach it? Because a lot of people, I guess, engage with the academic side of things, and it's like, I either can get rid of all of this and abandon it. What was your perspective when you first started?
I was not raised to be incredibly religious. I would consider myself agnostic growing up. I just I don't know, it didn't concern me a ton. I was interested in philosophies. I was interested in how people thought and taught about the world within these traditions. But as truth claims, it didn't really interest me very much. So when I joined the church, I did not have many preconceptions at all regarding what a religion is supposed to be, how you're supposed to approach the Bible, how you're supposed to think about creation and deity and all these other things. I was just coming to it from the perspective of a kid who thought he was pretty well informed about the world, but did get kicked out of the University of Northern Colorado with a 0.29 GPA. So was not quite as well informed as he would have told people.
Wow. Well, I would have never imagined you would have gotten kicked out of a school. That's crazy.
Yeah. It was a different world for me back then.
Yeah. Well, cool. So when you started doing these response videos on TikTok, obviously there's a root cause of some of those videos, like the misinformation that is presented. Before we kind of get into why you began to do that, or what kind of like made you do that, what do you and obviously there's a number of answers to this question, I think, but what do you think is kind of the root cause of such, like, at times blind misinformation, where there is information out there, but it is kind of ignored or not presented?
I think it comes down to speak in very broad terms, paint with a very broad brush. In my work in the cognitive science of religion, I found that a lot of stuff comes down to our intuitive perception of the world around us, because all the data that we are consuming every day and our perception of the world around us is all mediated by our intuitive cognition. It's not what we're intentionally thinking, it's what our brain is kind of letting us see and perceive and feel and smell and touch. And there are default settings and other things that we are conditioned to think based on the way all humans grow up. We all are dependent on other humans just to make it through infancy. And there are a number of human experiences that are universal. Everybody goes through them. And so it conditions our minds to think about the world in certain ways. And one of the fundamental ways that we perceive the world around us is as a social world, and we are concerned for our standing within that social world. And so we understand ourselves to be participating in certain social identities in different ways and to different degrees. And so a lot of the information that we're receiving is going to be interpreted by that conditioning to be either affecting positively, negatively, or neutrally our social standing. And overwhelmingly, we're going to have an intuitive attraction or bias towards the things that are going to increase our social standing or are going to make us feel good about our social identities or our social standing. And so a lot of times we have intuitive aversions to things that we see. And then what we do is we bring our reflective cognition, so that intentional, rational, logical side, and we try to defend those feelings. So if we see something online or hear something on the news or on the radio or on TV, and we kind of internally don't like, we start to come up with reasons why we don't like it, because we want that feeling to be accurate, to be good. And so we start building cases for why this is so. And I refer to this broadly as identity politics. And so the social identities that are most important to us are going to be those that most heavily influence how we experience the world around us. And so it's easy for us to, if we feel good about a piece of information because it confirms preconceived notions, or it makes us feel like our perspectives or our biases or even our prejudices are justified, are necessary, then we're not going to look very critically at that information. We're going to enjoy it, and we're going to like that feeling, and we're going to move on feeling justified in the way we understand the world. And so it's difficult to overcome those intuitive predispositions. It requires some discipline, some critical thinking. And nobody's perfect at it. We all are subject to it to one degree or another. But if we really take the time to try to look beyond that initial intuitive impulse and try to understand the data that we're seeing as they really are, as close to as they really are as we can get, it makes the world a little messier, a little more nuanced. It makes it a little more difficult to draw lines around groups and say this group is good, this group is bad. And it makes things a lot more complex. But ultimately, I think that is a much healthier way forward, a much healthier way to approach how we interact with others, with our families, with the communities around us, with the broader world. And in a world where we can access every single corner of the planet virtually instantaneously, I think it's that much more important that we take the time to apply some critical thinking to the information that we're getting, because some of the deep fake stuff and that kind of stuff, that is frightening. I don't know what the future holds for the news cycle and how we interact with the data that we're being fed every day.
Yeah. And what you mentioned about how like there's certain things when we come across an idea that kind of makes us clench up a little bit. That was my experience specifically with the Bible when I began my undergrad degree. And I was at a conservative school, but I was still being presented new information that was not even presented to me growing up in church. Like the Bible was just, this clean cut thing. And honestly, when you just read it, and that's something I've been trying to practice and do a better job at, is just reading it as it is. And it's very difficult to set aside those preconceived ideas and things like that. But there's still times where I'm like having to sometimes like set aside an idea that makes me feel better about a text, when in actuality, it probably is just a little more difficult to understand than what I'm trying to do with it. And so sometimes those videos, like the misinformation videos at times on the Bible on TikTok, for instance, sometimes those, I think people see them and it kind of like makes them feel better about an idea because it supports their viewpoint. And so when you kind of like started doing this, how like, had you been just like viewing, like when did you get on TikTok? Like what made you think to get on there? And what kind of spurred you to begin to respond to these videos?
Well, I had I understood TikTok to be just an app for young kids and folks in Korea who want to manipulate the U.S. government and stuff like that. But I started seeing people sharing TikTok videos on Twitter and on Instagram and on Facebook, and I noticed there were a number of videos that were addressing things that fell near or within my academic specialization. And the information was not always great. I could tell these were well-meaning folks who were doing, the best they could with the resources and the training they had. But I got the sense that there wasn't, nobody was a referee for biblical studies or religious studies on TikTok, despite there being a number of people who had, through their own diligence, had obviously done a lot of reading and highly educated themselves. And so I thought I'll get a TikTok account. I'll check it out. I'll see what's going on. See if who's in charge over there. And so this was probably about a year ago, and I maybe spent a month or two just kind of lurking. I don't know if they call that lurking on TikTok. That's what, when I was coming up, we called it lurking, when you just hung out and didn't ever comment or anything like that. And I decided I would try to dip my toe into making some videos responding to some specific pieces of misinformation where I had personal history with them. I think one of the first or maybe second video I posted on TikTok was about Jordan-led codices, which was something that was, been 11 years now. In fact, I think it was April 1st, 2011 was March 30th, 2011, when that news first broke. But I and some friends who are academics that had kind of made a group on Facebook to try to combat misinformation got a hold of this Jordan-led codices stuff, and were among some of the earliest folks speaking out against it, saying this is either a hoax or a fraud, or it's not genuine. And that attracted a lot of attention for my blog at the time, and I was on some radio shows, even got to interact once with the perpetrator of that whole hoax. He's not a fan of mine. But that was the first video that I responded to. I think I was like, I have personal experience with this. I know this inside and out, so I'm going to actually respond to this. And that kind of influenced the algorithm a tiny bit, so that I started seeing more of that stuff. And I thought, this might be a niche that I could fill here, bringing, at least to the degree I have specific expertise, bringing some scholarly knowledge to the channel. And I wanted to craft it in a way where things like my own personal religious beliefs were not relevant, were not something that people would get hung up on. Because when people hear Mormon, a lot of people immediately turn off. They don't want to hear anything. And I think I've demonstrated over almost a year on this channel that my scholarship is not influenced by LDS ideologies. And so I decided to frame my participation on TikTok as about combating misinformation, democratizing access to scholarly knowledge and resources and things like that, and that I was going to put data before dogma. And I think it struck a chord with some folks. And there were a few videos that did a lot of the legwork of getting me some attention out there, particularly one on God's wife. That was a big one. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you about that in a little while. So
that was that was something that got quite a bit of attention. And so I got my name out there a little bit, and that was pretty helpful. And so I'm, you know, the channel grows and it ebbs and flows. So I'm enjoying many of the people I'm interacting with. I've made some digital friends on TikTok. There are a lot of wonderful people out there, a lot of people who are curious about things, a lot of people who are not sure this is what they're looking for, but they want to at least give it a try. And it has helped me in a lot of ways, I think, increase my respect for a lot of what's going on out there. Because from the comfort of my home office, I can make a lot of assumptions about what people out there in the world are like and what they want when it comes to these kinds of data. But the interactions have helped me better understand that there are a lot better folks out there than I would have initially assumed.
Yeah.
And yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah. I think what you're presenting is really helpful, and I like reading through the comment sections on your videos just to kind of see what. And the thing that you mentioned about like the Mormon thing, like people, and my thing is like it's kind of like frustrating because I'll watch the videos and it's like, I guess people a lot of times don't sometimes realize it's almost like two separate worlds, and it's a shame that it is. But there's the academic study of the Bible that, if done in a way that I think is useful, it's not really influenced by religious doctrine, but it's just like what you mentioned, by data. And then there's like a faith devotional reading of the Bible. And sometimes I think people don't realize that there's actual separation of the two. And what you're doing is presenting like the Bible in its context, the influences around the Bible or the text of the ancient people. And so I think that that's kind of an interesting thing to like, when I read through, it's like, okay, I sometimes just assume that people are aware that there's this other world when there's not this awareness there. Has that been kind of your experience in doing some of this work?
Yeah, it's I have slowly realized the same, that I think it's perfectly natural to think of the Bible as a piece of literature that I can approach as a piece of literature, and that doesn't threaten anything. And it has surprised me for how many people that is very clearly not the case. And I still, every single day, will get people saying, I need to know what your personal beliefs on this are. And I understand that it's because that's how they're going to decide intuitively if it can be trusted or not. If I can tag that base, then they can let down their defenses. But if I don't tag that base, then they're still going to be defensive about this. And I think that demonstrates how strong the identity politics are in this. But yeah, when I approach the Bible in a TikTok video, it's absolutely not as anything that I am beholden to, that is authoritative over me. There are no expectations that I hold about how I'm going to think about the text. And I think for a lot of people that's refreshing. It's refreshing just to see that on social media. For some people, it is refreshing to see that from someone who also has a faith. For other people, that's annoying. But I think it's attracted attention from different sides, which I think helps keep the conversation robust and productive. And so I'm happy for that, and I'm going to keep doing it like that. And for the most part, most of my videos, the majority of them, are probably being critical of a more conservative devotional stance on the Bible. But every now and then, I'm also going to go in the other direction and say, identity politics are not exclusive to people who belong to religious faiths. The non-religious and the anti-religious can be just as mired in identity politics. And I made a video recently about this, where I talked about atheism and how people try to impose or enforce a prescriptive definition of atheism. And I got a lot of folks who suddenly decided they don't like hearing from me anymore.
Yeah, you're going to get the best of both worlds. You get the fundamental Christians and the fundamental atheists. That's cool. Yeah. So that's kind of where I also had to like think through, and that was me. Like I did not realize there was this whole other world. And for me, like I was kind of in a similar place, like where I had a professor, and I was taking like a first and second Kings class. And I had honestly in my church growing up, I'd never really read through the thing, like just reading it. It was
Right.
always looking for what is the spiritual thing to take from this? And
Yeah.
he would ask these questions that I had never been asked before. And the logical side of me, I was like, some of these sacrificial numbers and things like that, this doesn't add up. And I would go to his office and like what people do, I guess, when they want to hear your standpoint on it, I would ask him, well, what do you think? What do you think? And he would never give me an answer. And it was the best thing that he could have done for me at that time, because I needed to like just work through those things on my own.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's what I really appreciate about the content that you're putting out, is that it just gives people kind of like a taste of what there is out there. And it kind of can, I think, encourage a lot of people to like hopefully find resources and begin to like study some of this stuff on their own. So I wanted to ask, how do you think that biblical studies can maybe be a little more accessible for the average person? So I know what you're doing is really, really helpful. And I don't see any other content like what you're doing, just kind of in a sense, like the bluntness of it is very useful. But how can maybe it become more accessible for the average person?
That's that's something that people have been talking about for a long, long time. I remember being in a parking lot after class one day at Trinity Western University, which is an evangelical university where I did my second master's degree, talking with some of the other students, and they were going through, I think, this paradigm shift that you talk about, where they were like, we didn't learn any of this in my MDiv. This is new information. This is stuff that I wish I had been given much earlier. But their worry was, I'm glad that I have this information now, but how can we transmit this information to the pews, where this can help people make better decisions about how they live their faith and help them understand stuff better. But there's that really steep learning curve where you got to get over the that cringiness, and that's kind of a perpetual concern for them. And I think the academic world is structured in a way so that it's not very accessible. And people get jobs teaching, and they're expected to publish a certain amount. And when they make that their goal, and obviously they have research interests and they want people to understand these things, but because of all kinds of different assignments that you have associated with the job beyond just teaching, and all kinds of other issues, they just make it as hard as possible to create scholarship that is publicly accessible. And some folks have done a good job of getting it out there. Bart Ehrman is somebody I think who does a good job, and my dissertation supervisor, Francesca Stavrokopoulou, just released a book, God and Anatomy, that's supposed to be aimed toward a more popular audience. But I think we need more open access scholarship, and for open access journals, usually somebody's paying lots of money for all this stuff to be published. And so they are few and far between. I would like to see more open access scholarship. I would like to see more scholarship written for public consumption, more trade books coming from scholars of religion and the Bible. I think we're at a period where higher education is also shifting. And I don't know what it's going to look like in the future, but I would like to see more easy access to the literature that is out there. Copyright stuff has a lot to do with why people can't access stuff. Hopefully we can get beyond the ways we've thought about copyright in the past. Like my book that's coming out, it got pushed back a little bit, so it's probably going to be early next year. It's going to be an open access book. Now, I didn't have to pay any money, luckily, for that, and I'm not making any money off of it. But I wanted my first book to be something that anybody could access, and it'll be a PDF that anybody can download, anybody can share. So if the academic community makes it so scholars can share more of their research without publishers giving them a hard time, or without compromising their own well-being, then I think we'll see a lot more, because there are a lot of people out there who want to democratize that access, but they're constrained by publishers, by universities.
Yeah. I would even, so I remember there've been a few times where if I'm working on like a paper or something and I'll have to pay like $70 or almost $100 to access a PDF just to get a source. And so I can relate exactly. And the average person in school or that's not in school is probably not worried about that. And I think that it's interesting because a lot of stuff that gets published, obviously popularly, is going to be the things that sell. And a lot of times in the Christianity in America, that's going to be one viewpoint of academics, which is kind of a whole nother rabbit hole we can get into. But so I was just curious, what is your book on?
So the one I have coming out beginning of next year is a revised version of my dissertation. So I'm basically talking about what divine images are and why in the ancient world they could think of divine images as being both identified with as well as distinct from the deities that they indexed. And we have variations on this theme in the Hebrew Bible. The messenger of Adonai, for instance, in many places is explicitly referred to as God and self-identifies as God. So that is a species of that concept of divine images being identified with the deity. And also the early Christology. I argue in an appendix to the book that understanding how divine images were both associated with and dissociated from their deities can help us better understand how Christ was understood to be both connected with and also independent from the God of Israel. And I talk about cognitive science of religion, cognitive linguistics, how these two frameworks can help us better understand how they likely thought about and talked about the concept of deity anciently and the concepts of divine agency. So it's difficult to distill down to an elevator pitch, but I think folks who are interested in the development of concepts of deity and how the God of the Bible evolved over time, I think they will be interested in it. I think it'll be fascinating for them.
Yeah. And I think that that's something that is, it's very new to a lot of people, is that idea that development of God, at least in the Hebrew context, at least, of reading the Old Testament. And I'd love to and what's interesting about this whole conversation is something that my wife will mention sometimes, is like we have conversations about like just the Bible and questions that we have and things like that, is she'll say like, well, I feel like I have to have a freaking PhD to even understand what I'm reading. And I think that that's the struggle with all of this, is a person can hear the conversation we're having and be like, I don't know what I'm even like doing here. I don't know what to do with the Bible. So, before I go on to the next question on that, do you have any kind of like thoughts on like the person that maybe is working through, I guess the hot topic word is deconstruction, or just rethinking how they approach and read the Bible when they come across just new data?
I think the concept of deconstruction, I think, refers to the fact that the lenses through which we interpret the world are not, they are the product of years and years and years of ideas that have been stacked on top of each other. And to understand why we're seeing the world the way we are, we need to pull those things apart. We need to deconstruct those frameworks and then try to understand what pieces fit, what pieces don't fit, where the pieces came from, which pieces we want to keep, which one we want to get rid of. And one of the best ways to engage in that, I think, is to be more introspective about why we may feel the way we do when we're reading the text, why we're reading the text. Within the Latter-day Saint community, there are a lot of folks who will read in the scriptures because they feel they have to do that every day for, a certain number of verses or a certain amount of time or something like that. And so in that sense, it's kind of checking a box. It's about, for some folks, it's about communing with the Spirit of God. If I'm in the scriptures, then God is with me. And so it is about having that time communing with God. For other folks, they want to understand these narratives and this history. Some folks want to have specific questions or topics they want to study. But if we understand why we're going to the text, that helps us pick the most effective tools for getting out of the text what we want to. And so for folks who are looking to understand it better from a critical point of view, one of the most helpful things we can do if we have limited resources, if we can't go get a commentary or a study Bible or something like that, I think just thinking about what an author wanted a text to achieve is a very helpful tool. That's a great place to start, because that helps us better understand why they're saying things the way they're saying them, why they're putting them in the order that they're putting them. And one of the clues that can help us there is genre. There are texts that are prophetic. There are texts that are historical. There are texts that are poetic. You have lament texts. You have complaint texts. You have a lot of different genres in the text. And the better we can understand those, the better we can understand the conventions that people are using, and the better we can understand what they're trying to accomplish with their texts. And I think that's one of the difficult things for some folks who approach the Bible devotionally, to grasp that the author wanted this text to do something and that they intentionally shaped it a specific way so it would do that. But if you can get over that, if you can at least put a pin in that and just think about why the author of Jonah would have written their text the way they did. Because for a native reader or hearer of the text, they hear, the word of God came to Jonah and said, go preach destruction to the Ninevites. 40 days, I'll destroy the city. At the time, you would expect them to be ecstatic and to happily go do this because they were just absolutely loathed. But Jonah runs the other way. And so an informed reader, somebody is who understands the historical context here, is thinking, well, this is a prophetic text. They're supposed to do this, but they're doing the opposite. Something's wrong here. What's going on? And that tension is what creates interest in the story. And it is what makes the reader or the hearer go on. And, they go down into the boat, they go down into the side of the boat, then they, get thrown in the sea, then they're in the belly of a fish. And these are all opposite to what a reader expects a prophet to do. And then they go and they say, okay, I'll preach destruction. And there's no, it's not a conditional destruction. It's just 40 days and it's all over. It's not unless you repent. But they end up repenting. And that's the big reveal of the book. So the person who is filled with this tension, why is Jonah acting the opposite of the way a prophet is supposed to act? You get to the end and God says, I'm going to spare the Ninevites. And then Jonah says, I knew this would happen. I knew you would forgive them, and I would rather die than see them receive forgiveness. And so the author has built all this tension by taking this genre and flipping it on its head and having Jonah do the opposite of what everybody expects him to do. And then that reveal at the end allows all that tension to be released. And we now understand that Jonah was upset because he knew God was going to forgive these people. And he, like all Israelites at that time period, or Judahites, would have loved nothing more than to see them suffer. So, that's a text that a lot of Christians don't want to engage with. It doesn't seem very significant to them at all. It is generally only comes up in discussions about the sign of Jonah and Christ's resurrection and things like that. But
yeah.
it's actually a very powerful story about forgiveness
yeah.
and about somebody not wanting to do what God wants them to do.
Yeah. The first time I heard Jonah be presented differently was through a guy named Tim Mackey through
Uh-huh.
the Bible Project.
Bible Project. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I listened to the sermon series on it, and he was like, this piece of literature is very similar to like satire. And it's very similar to like what he was like, it's kind of like Saturday Night Live, but in an ancient text. And I was like, wait a second. I didn't think that this is what this was about. But the thing is, when I have been presented with some of those things and am able to kind of move away from different readings, I find more like beauty in some of the passages. There's like such more clarity and like, oh, the author here was trying to communicate something maybe different than what I had thought it was, but it makes more sense in the context of what they are doing and what they're trying to present. One thing I hear a word you use, and I'll make sure I pronounce this right, is it univocality or something like that?
Univocality. Yeah.
Univocality. And you mentioned how that is kind of I guess an issue in some ways, because it's kind of an assumption that many people come to the Bible with. And I think it is, I think the way in which we view books in general, we view books as, unless it's in the table of contents where the chapters are all written by different authors, we view the books to be just one piece of work. Whereas with the Bible, a lot of times, and I have done this and grew up in this, is coming with the idea that the Bible is just one voice. What can be the, I guess, issue in reading that in that way? And like, I guess, what are some examples that we can see where maybe the data doesn't support that, maybe in the text?
So I think the biggest threat of doing that is because if we come to it assuming that it all has one single unified voice, then when we get to two texts where the original authors may have flatly disagreed with each other, in fact, there are some places where one author is writing specifically to disagree with another writer, we need to make them agree. And what that usually means is holding up the one we already agree with and then finding a way to silence the other one and reread it in a way that agrees with the author that they probably originally vehemently disagreed with. And so it does, I think it does harm to the text. It silences biblical authors in the interest of preserving this assumption about the Bible. And so we misunderstand a lot of texts in the Bible. And the easiest example to point to, one that I think is pretty classic, is James and Paul, where you have James seems to be directly quoting Paul in Romans, where he talks about Abraham. Now we see that Abraham was justified by faith and not by works. And then James says, and so we see a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. And they both just finished telling the story of Abraham offering his only son. And that's one that's, I think, and many scholars think, that James is disagreeing with Paul, saying, no, Paul's got it wrong here. But with the Reformation, with Luther, who didn't like this, put James in the back in the appendix of his original translation, called it the Epistle of Straw. Ever since then, we've come up with all kinds of different hermeneutic tricks, for lack of a kinder word, to make James agree with Paul. And a lot of ink and blood has been spilled on trying to make James agree with Paul. And I think that just does violence to James, to silence what he was trying to say, just because we need them to agree, because of the ideology that we bring to the text. And I think this shows that for many people, the Bible is not in charge. It's our assumptions about what the Bible is supposed to be that is in charge of how we read it. And that is one of the demonstrations, in my opinion, of how we don't get doctrine from the Bible. We get doctrine from identity politics and other things, and the Bible is just our justification. It's just our excuse. And yeah, I think racism and slavery is another thing where You've had people arguing from both sides of that. During in the early 19th century in America, you had preachers preaching abolition based on the Bible, and then you had other preachers preaching slavery based on the Bible, because the texts have no meaning in and of themselves. They only have meaning to the degree that readers create meaning. And so there's a lot of different things we can make them say. And if we expect them to say certain things, they're going to say those things.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the first examples I had come across of just not realize, for a long time, I just assumed what I was told, that, for instance, like with the Pentateuch being Mosaic authorship.
Yeah.
And I think it's JDEP. Is that what it? Yeah. So that was the first time I had ever come across this idea of like, oh wait, there's like a lot of different influences going into why certain portions of the Pentateuch are written this way and others are written this way, whether it be in regards to sacrificial stuff or whatever other things. And when I came across that, I was like, oh wow, this is very different than what I had thought. And I think that most Christians come to the Bible with the univocality viewpoint. I've heard my whole life pretty much that all verses point to Jesus, and it's kind of I actually had a professor in college that was like, no, they don't, and I was like, wait a second, I thought they did. So I think that stuff is really, I think, necessary for rethinking and approaching it. And I think I've always felt like when you do that, you begin to value the text a little more, because it requires you to actually respect it and not just like kind of just throw your hands up at it. It says what it says. It means what it means.
Yeah.
And I've found that to be pretty helpful.
And I think it makes it a lot easier to resonate with the text when these are human issues going on, and we can see that this author is struggling with something, is trying to communicate something, is wants you to respond in a certain way. That makes it more human and easier to relate with. Because I never related to the text. I've seen people talk about, just everything's about Jesus and just want to praise Jesus 24/7. It's like, that does not interest me. That does not sound exciting. And so if the texts say that, I am not interested in those texts. But when I get into them and I see the human element in them and see, oh, they're trying to structure power. They don't like the king, or they don't like this group of priests over here, and they want to make it. It's more interesting to me. That's a soap opera that I'll watch. But yeah, for some, because their identities depend upon a specific perspective, they don't, they have those guardrails up. They won't let themselves look at it that way.
Yeah. A video that you mentioned earlier that had done some numbers, was the one on Yahweh. I believe it's Yahweh and his Asherah. Was that the? Mm-hmm. I'd love for our listeners to just kind of hear what that was about. And I'm just particularly interested in like, what are the implications when we kind of come across stuff like that, I guess, archaeologically, and what does that show us about the influence of ancient Near Eastern religion and just the influence of that in developments of how Yahweh was worshipped and eventually became viewed?
Yeah, so we have a handful of texts in the Bible that refer to Asherah, and generally they use it as a reference to a cultic object of some kind. They say you can chop it down, you can burn it, so it seems to be like a wooden pole of some kind. And we know from other materials, from Phoenicia and from Ugard and from elsewhere, that Asherah was a goddess that was worshipped in the area, Northwest Semitic goddess, and she was the consort, the partner of the high deity El, the mother, the creatrix is what one Ugaritic text calls her, of the 70 gods. And the texts of the Bible speak pejoratively about her and talk about how her cultic object was in the temple and that people were worshiping her under every green tree and all these things. And so we've always been aware that there was some worship of a goddess going on in early Israel, but the archaeological discoveries of the Ugaritic literature of some temples, some state-sanctioned temples, and some iconography makes it, as well as the advances in source and textual criticism, we have a better understanding of when some of these texts came together. And we see something interesting. We see that most of the texts, if not all the texts that have bad things to say about Asherah, all date to around the time of Josiah or after. And we have archaeological evidence suggesting that before the time of Josiah, the worship of a goddess seems to have been pretty normative. We cannot find any indication anybody had a hard time with it. We have temples that were likely run by Jerusalem, and we have a new one that we discovered in Tel Motzah that corresponds to the first temple. There's the one in Tel Arad that seems to have been decommissioned around the end of the 8th century, so just before around 700 BCE. And while everybody thought, oh, this was Hezekiah destroying the other temples, implementing the Deuteronomistic reforms or whatever, but it wasn't destroyed. The divine images were just laid on their side within the Holy of Holies, and then there were just 6 feet of dirt put over top. And so many scholars today believe Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, was coming in and was destroying city after city after city. And many folks think that they were hiding the temple to come back and recommission it later. And you have a big and a small incense altar. One of those incense altars may have been for Adonai, one may have been for Asherah. They found 2 different standing stones, but we think that only one was ever operative at a time. But the accumulation of data, we even have some inscriptions and some drawings from around 800 BCE that talk about Adonai and his Asherah. And one of them includes a drawing of a male and a female, and they are drawn using kind of stereotypical Bes imagery, and Bes was an Egyptian deity, but they use that imagery to represent different deities, so that's not incredibly unusual. Basically, the accumulation of data makes clear that in earliest Israel, God had a wife, and this wife was Asherah, and people worshipped Asherah. And it was not until likely around the time of Josiah that they decided, you know what, I kind of like it when everybody has to bring all their sacrifices to Jerusalem and all their offerings and all their money. It all gets funneled into Jerusalem, where I live, kind of like this. So we're going to now make it mandatory. And we're going to, and then we come up with this is where Josiah finds the book of the law in the temple. He's like, I like the way this was working. Oh, I found the book of the law. Look, it says we should keep doing it this way. In fact, we're supposed to have been doing it this way the whole time. Imagine that. And so Deuteronomy kind of comes along at a convenient time and introduces a bunch of new things that were never a part of the other law codes that happened to serve Josiah's own structuring of power. And then you get into the exile, and some of the earlier history was likely rewritten to suggest, we know they were doing this stuff back then. We now have this idea that we never should have been doing this stuff. So we're going to talk about these kings as wicked. And we're going to say they did not follow after Adonai, when in reality, they most likely were worshiping Adonai alongside Asherah. And nobody had a problem with it at the time. And this is another indication that Israel did not suddenly come out of nowhere ex nihilo with this entirely unique perspective on deity, but rather that it grew out of the same ideas everybody else had. But then they formed a group, and the experiences and the identity politics of that group, as they're being knocked around in this area, the Philistines are coming after them, the Aramaeans are coming after them, the Moabites are coming after them, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, all of that pressure forces them to change their perceptions and their ideas about deity. And it changes in ways that other nations don't experience. And so slowly, Adonai becomes a unique deity. And then during this whole time, their authority, their purview is limited to Israel. You can't worship Adonai outside of Israel. So Naaman, the Syrian king, what does he do when he wants to worship Adonai back in Syria? He takes a chunk of Israel back with him. 2 cartloads of Israelite soil so that he can worship Adonai on Israelite soil. And then you have the exile, and you have Judeans in Babylon who don't know what to do. How can we sing the songs of Adonai in a foreign land? And then we get this change in how they viewed God. God was no longer just confined to Israel. God is now universalized. And this is what I have argued in a 2018 paper that Psalm 82 is doing. Calls the divine council, I'm got a lawsuit against you all. You're wicked. You're letting the foundations of the earth be rocked. You're all going to die like men. Get out of here. And then at the very end, the psalmist says, rise up, O God, for you will inherit all nations. And then the next psalm calls Adonai most high over all the earth. So I argue that this is the exilees arguing for Adonai taking over direct rule of all the nations, and in this way making it possible for Adonai to be accessed in Babylon by the Judahites who could not access them before. So, but yeah, I would suggest that it's more accurate to think of the God of Israel as becoming a unique, exclusive sole deity over the course of time rather than suddenly showing up that way.
Yeah. And that was something that I was already kind of familiar with that idea, but the idea of like, there was still like these other influences that are involved in, the Israelite worship at the time, and then they redact and edit and change things. I was not aware of a lot of that till I saw that video. I'd never thought through the idea that Yahweh or Adonai may have had a wife, and I can see why a video like that would like kind of blow up, because I'm sure a lot of other people were like, "This isn't true. This guy doesn't know what he's talking about." And I find it really fascinating. Another thing that you mentioned, and before we kind of close out, the first time I had ever heard about the divine council, or the idea of the divine council, I just always had like kind of glossed over, not understanding what certain things meant in the Bible, was through Michael Heiser. And he presents we did an interview and he talks through some of that. I obviously there seems to be a shift in Judaism, at least, or in later parts of Israelite worship, where they move away from this idea of having a divine council. What do you think was the reason why, like, early portions of the Old Testament are pretty committed to this idea that God has this pantheon in a way around him? And what do you think caused that shift away from that?
In my forthcoming book, I talk a little bit about this, and I've got another book I'm working on that will be kind of the evolution of the God of the Bible, where I'm going to talk about the earliest periods and how things changed. But I would argue that as this rhetoric is going on about our God being better than all the other gods, the divine council is made up of the patron deities of all the nations. And when we universalize Adonai and say all the other deities of the nations are now deposed, and Adonai is going to take over direct rule of the nations, you can't have that divine council in place, but you also can't just stop talking about it, because these texts that we brought with us from the past still talk about it. And what I argue happens is the pantheon gets shoved down into the lowest tier of deity, to the servile class of deities. They all become angels, basically messenger deities. And so you have Genesis 6 talks about the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God. What do we do with this now that we know the sons of God are not in control of the nations, but Adonai is in control of the nations? Well, this is where the book of Enoch comes in the Hellenistic period. And it interprets the sons of God as angels, as rebellious angels, wicked angels that come down and teach humanity how to do makeup and, all this kinds of knowledge that is corrupting the youth kind of talk. But the gods are now all angels. And you have further developments later on. A lot of the angels get given assignments over different functions of the universe. And where you used to have a patron deity over each nation, you now have a guardian angel over each nation. So in the book of Daniel, when it talks about the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece, and then Michael is the head of the princes, this reflects that idea of patron deities. This reflects that idea of patron deities, but it's now been reoriented so that they're just angels. They're harmless. They fight amongst themselves, but Michael is able to crack his whip and he can take care of everything. And I would like to see more research done on this. I've had this question asked a number of times, and I have feelings on this, but I haven't done enough research to be able to say definitively that this is the case. But what I think is interesting is you had prayers to these angels. A lot of people still wanted to interact with them the way you might interact with a deity. And then later on in the Common Era in Christianity, you have people interacting with saints the same way that people interacted with angels before them, and the same way that people interacted with the patron deities of the nations before that. And so I would argue that the same framework is perpetuated throughout time, but we're just repopulating it with people who are acceptable to be in those positions. And so in 1 century they prayed to angels, can you go before the deity and ask the deity to bless me? And then a few centuries later, you pray to a saint and you say, can you go before the deity and ask the deity to bless me? And there are a lot of ways that these ideas are intuitive. They're not going to go anywhere as long as the words and the ideas are still in the texts that they are reading. But they need to renegotiate who's allowed to be there with every new generation. So, yeah, I think that's a fascinating development. I'd love to see more discussion about that.
Yeah, and when I first had kind of realized some of it and listened to some stuff on it, it was on the Book of Job, and I had always been taught that it was Lucifer that had come to God, and God let Satan go to. And it is, I mean, it's Hasatan, but it's not necessarily this demon figure, but someone that's probably a part of this divine council that comes as like a adversary. And it's just, so the reason I asked that question is when you kind of start like realizing some of these things, I think for listeners that are listening, it can be like kind of crazy at first, but it starts to make some things not necessarily make sense, but make a little more sense when reading the passages. So I've always, I think this stuff's really interesting. It shows us like they were not thinking the way we are about spirituality and religion and faith. And I think getting to a place where we can read the Bible and try and understand what were they thinking, what were they approaching it is I think the most healthy way to read it. So I think that's fascinating. Were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, I think a lot of times we read the Bible expecting to find our own social identities in there. So one of the reasons people are resistant to reading the text this way is because that severs that ideological link with them. And most Christians today want to read the New Testament and see Christians in there that they can relate with. They don't want to read the New Testament and say, these people thought completely differently from me, because that severs that link. And so I can understand why the impulse is strong to push back against that. But that impulse is also the product of thousands of years of social development and conditioning. So yeah,
I completely agree with you. So I was going to ask for if you could suggest for listeners that are really interested in the Bible and maybe just they hear some of the stuff we're talking about, maybe like what are two maybe books or resources, one on just simply how you approach and read the Bible, and maybe one that's specific to that a layperson or whatever could read on maybe some of the ancient Near Eastern influence of reading.
Well, I'll talk about three. One author I enjoy quite a bit is Peter Enns, who writes about, and he's writing for a believing audience, but he's trying to help them think a little more critically about these things. And so The Bible Tells Me So, I think is a great book that talks about how complex it is and how we need to let go of some of the dogmas about how we approach the Bible. I think that one's great. For someone who wants to hear about how the Bible developed and how it's been read over the centuries and why the interpretations that are common today are common, where they came from, John Barton's book, A History of the Bible, is phenomenal. I think it's about 5 years old now, but it goes through how these texts developed, how they became canonized, how they were read in the early years, how they were read in later years. And that book is really good. I highly recommend that one. And then if someone wants to understand better the Canaanite Northwest Semitic origins or context for the development of Israel, and particularly related to the concept of God, Mark Smith's book, The Origins of Biblical Monotheism, is still the standard. I think it's from 2001. It's over 20 years old, but it is a phenomenal discussion of the Ugaritic literature, so that Northwest Semitic literary context for the development of Israel and how the deity became more like how we see it today. Cool. Although I do disagree with Mark on some things, but his book is still phenomenal.
That's awesome. Well, cool. Well, I really appreciate you coming on, Dan, just kind of talking with us, talking with me about just a bunch of different stuff. I know we covered a broad range of stuff, but I really do appreciate the stuff that you're doing on TikTok. I never thought a dancing app would cause people to have access to biblical scholarship, but I think it's really cool. So thanks again for coming on and just what you're continuing to do. Is there anywhere other than TikTok that people can find access to some of your thoughts and works?
Yeah, so I'm also on Twitter and Instagram, and my handle is the same across all three platforms, McClellan, which is, by the way, how I spelled my last name for people when I was living in Uruguay so that they could pronounce it, because they don't like all the consonant clusters in my nice Scottish last name. So nice. But yeah, I'm on Instagram and Twitter. Twitter is a little more for kind of social commentary, political stuff. Instagram, I share a lot of stuff I share here, but also I'm trying to get more into the reels, shorter stuff, which is not accommodating to the kinds of things I'm talking about, but there's a good crowd over there, so I'd like to be able to give them what they want to.
Sweet. Well, cool. I'll look that stuff up and put it in the show notes. I would encourage you as a listener to check that out. So Dan, thanks again for coming on. Hope your work continues to go well with your book and everything that you're doing.
All right. Well, thank you, Blake. I appreciate the time and I appreciate the kind words.